Hello and welcome to Unicom Organized, Assess and Manage Energy Risk Professionally Conducted Virtually. To brief you about Unicom, we are a global B2B brand based in India, Bangalore and Calcutta, and UK London, specialized in customer reach and knowledge sharing for IT and finance industry. Our key focus lies around conferences conducted across the globe on agile, testing, DevOps, finance, and other emerging technologies. We are also involved in delivering training in FRM, ERP, Agile, EPAT, and so. Please visit our website at www.unicomlearning.com to learn more about our upcoming events and trainings. To introduce our speakers and panelists for today, let me start with Mr. Ji Zhou, Director, Risk Analytics, Exelon Constellation, Mr. Brett Friedman, Managing Partner of Windhall Risk Analytics, Mr. Kaushik Mukherjee, Energy Risk Specialist, Mr. Sanjoy Chaudhary, CEO of Radiant Consulting, Mr. Michael Engner, Energy Market Manager, Market Operations and Risk Management of Austin Energy, and finally Mr. Parvez Rangwala, Head of Treasury Operation and Trade Finance Operation of Emirates Global Aluminium. I would like to welcome Mr. Ji Zhou to deliver his 10-minute talk for the day, which shall be followed by our panel session on Assess and Manage Energy Risk Professionally, moderated by my colleague, Mr. Alec McCurtain. To drop questions for our panelists during the panel session, kindly log in through Slido. For more details on how to join in through Slido, please refer to the chat box on GoToWebinar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ji Zhou. By way of introduction, I am a Director of Risk Analytics at Exelon. Exelon is a US-based Fortune 100 energy company. So in this role, I'm responsible for promoting evidence-based, analytics-oriented approaches to assess enterprise-level risks, optimize business portfolios, and evaluate strategic options. Prior to moving to this role, I was head of mid-office quant of Exelon's commercial arm, Constellation, supporting various energy, trading, and risk management activities. I also served in the curriculum development committee of GARP's ERP program. So today, I'd like to briefly touch on the disruption risks that a lot of energy companies face in light of the energy sector transition. So before we get going, I just want to mention all views here are my own and it has nothing to do with Exelon or GARP. All right, so I'm sure you are aware of what we are dealing with today, the pandemic, which affects everyone's life and is expected to have long-lasting, dramatic impacts to achieve. I don't think I need to spend too much time on other geopolitical issues. So with all of these and including many other factors, it only confirms that reliable, secure, sustainable, clean, and cheap energy resources will benefit the globe, the countries either developed or developing, and all the individuals. So along those lines, as you can imagine, an energy transition is really inevitable and it is needed sooner than later. So thanks to all the policy pushes and technology trends, the transition is really accelerating. And there are three pronounced trends, namely decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. So to elaborate it a little bit, decarbonization is highly related to electrification. We have made some tremendous progress on electric vehicle these days. And there are numerous researches and investments on electrifying other energy consumptions, like mid to heavy duty vehicles, air travels, space heating, etc. Decarbonization and electrification can really help to optimize the grid infrastructure, achieve climate goals, encourage innovations, improve energy efficiency and productivity. So at the end of the day, it will generate a lot of economic growth. Then decentralization, it is another key component. It is really about democratize the energy transmission and distribution systems. This is stimulated by the advancements in distributed energy sources like rooftop solar, And if paired with a mature distributed storage technology, it can really disrupt a lot of incumbent energy companies. We will come back to this in a minute. Then the third piece is about digitalization. So some of the supporting technologies are well known, like Internet of Things, blockchain, artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud computing, etc. So these are very critical as we will need to manage distributed systems in the context of decentralization, powered by an increasing variety of unconventional energy sources. So it is more than a catalyst and has received a further boost in the wake of the pandemic. So all of these trends act in concert, enabling and enforcing changes beyond their individual contributions. And this will certainly create an entirely different ecosystem in the future. Now, really, what's the impact to the incumbents? So let's think about this. There are some early adopters of distributed energy resources, say rooftop solar. Someone installed rooftop solar on their roofs. So as a result, they would consume less power from the grid. Or in other words, utilities would serve less load. While on the other hand, utilities, they have to keep investing to maintain and improve the grid infrastructure. So the total cost actually will increase. So this leads to the question, okay, so you have increased the cost, but now you have reduced the customer base or the non-adopters. You have to socialize these increased costs to this reduce the customer base. Then coupled with the declining cost of solar PV, it will only make the adoptions more and more attractive. So this potential self-reinforcing scenario is the so-called utility death spiral. Well, so then especially when battery storage technology matures, people start to cut off from the grid. These traditional monopoly type of business models will become irrelevant. So it is really a disruptive risk to incumbents. And as many of you have known, the process of classic disruption has been well documented. It usually begins with incumbent overconfidence as new entrants or competitors with alternative business models establish a toehold, possibly in a niche or underserved part of the market. Then during this stage, incumbents ignore or downplay new entrants and believe it's impossible to challenge a monopoly. This overconfidence quickly transitions into a sudden collapse in incumbents' market value when the industry fundamental change is recognized. It may take some time before hitting a transition point when shareholders or other stakeholders become aware of the incipient threat. But at this point, any efforts from the incumbents can be too little and too late. Then the final stage is an ongoing decline that may last for many years. A common theme is that the company is no longer relevant and is viewed as a proverbial dinosaur in comparison to the successful disruptor. So this is real. But really, as a risk manager, what can we do? So as highlighted in one of the World Economic Forum's reports, even we are fully aware of the situation, there is no silver bullet. And it's really hard to define some universal strategy on what exactly an incumbent should do. Not to mention, there are a lot of other unknowns in the energy industry during the transition. So at a high level, one can categorize the available options into really like 3 buckets, right? So you can either delay the trend, or you ride with the trend, or otherwise you shape or lead the trend. But understandably, a successful pivot or growth usually requires a combination of these options executed at the right times with disciplined in or out strategies. But in this regard, a robust risk management program can really increase the likelihood of success. So I tried to list, a few things here that I think can be really helpful. But instead of me going through the list, I really want to talk about why I think these are very important. So just like, managing market risk, you would want to have a suite of risk metrics, like as you set up risk limits, so that you would be able to tell if a trading desk is not causing you any troubles. So it is similar when you are dealing with strategic disruption risks. So we are not really able to run Monte Carlos and produce all the possible outcomes. But what we should really be able to do is to answer questions like, what are some of the scenarios that could kill the company? If we stress test our business strategies with the most critical assumptions, what will happen? If we then, or do we have a very effective way to discover and monitor emerging and existential risks? Or if we execute our strategy as is, what could be our greatest regrets in the future? Then these steps can really help. And at the end of the day, can help you to confirm if your strategy is agile, adaptive, and more importantly, risk-informed. So this is vitally important in dealing with these disruption risks. Nevertheless, I'd say the risk professionals in private sector have some very important roles to play in this kind of transition. And one of our core values is to be able to challenge the business in a well-informed manner. But in order to do that, you want to really get prepared, and there are many ways of doing it. Then the 2 certificates that GARP offer, the energy risk professionals and the sustainability and climate risk certificates, are really rich sources to pick up industry knowledge from some very basic concepts to the most recent developments. So I think, my personal view is it can really pave the way for you to become a successful risk manager. Thank you very much.
So Z, thank you very much for a great presentation. Just to introduce myself, I'm Alec McCutcheon. I'm one of the directors of Unicom. I'm very pleased to be moderating this part of the event. Just as a reminder, before we start on a panel, what we're planning to do, we'll have a panel session for about 20 minutes where we'll put some questions to the 6 great panelists that we have here today. And we're also opening up for Q&A. As my colleague Rapti mentioned at the beginning, okay, so if everybody's ready, we'll start with the first question, if I may. I'd like to perhaps start off by asking this to Sanjoy. Sanjoy, what are the various mitigation techniques of energy risk?
I couldn't understand. Can you please repeat?
Yeah, sure. What are the various mitigation techniques of energy risk?
Essentially, there are various mitigation techniques of energy risk. So the various ways how energy risk can be mitigated are as follows. Like, say, you can avoid energy risk, but that's not a very kind of prudent measures, because if you are running into a kind of business involving energy products, you need to kind of confront the risks, and you need to manage it much better way. So one is that you need to accept those risks, and then you need to basically try to hedge those risks. Okay, so when have, when you mention about hedging the risk, you can essentially mean a kind of risk transference as well as risk limitation. Now, in the various ways, like first of all, you need to identify what are the various where the risks coming from. And in energy markets, it's slightly different as compared to the financial risk management, as such that though typically the most of the risk management techniques are in vogue, like you need to see what are the risks you are encountering. Like you have the standard risk like market risk or operational risks, where essentially energy risks a lot of things to do with operational risk apart from typical market risks. So when operational risks essentially are concerned, you need to essentially first identify, first of all, where from your risks are coming, which is very kind of critical in the sense of what we call as the KRIs, the key risk indicators. And you need to also understand that what are the various typical performances you need to identify, which is the KPIs, the key performance indicators. And you need to work accordingly to essentially manage those kind of risks as far as the trying to build up various scenarios, as G already mentioned earlier, that what can possibly go wrong. And you need to see that if certain things goes wrong, what will be the quantum of essentially the loss? So we need a business. So you need to have those adequate capital in place, which you need to essentially ensure that your business continuity goes on. So this is typically a going concern concepts. So as far as the risk managers, the regulators are concerned, that's the foremost objective of risk management. We need to essentially find out that how various ways energy risk, we are talking about energy risk, so specifically energy risk, that what are the various kind of techniques which you can include in order to mitigate those risks. Like suppose, take for instance, retrofitting the buildings to make them more energy efficient. Or you can adopt the renewable energy source like solar, wind, or small hydro. Because as of now, globally, the renewable energy sources are very limited as compared to the fossil fuels which you're using, which is typically only about 1/4 of the energy which you're using globally is still only renewable energies. And then you can use various kind of sustainable kind of environment or the transport, rapid transport systems in the cities. As of now, electrical vehicles are typically being used. So those are various kind of ways in order to able to kind of mitigate the various risks which are coming out through the energy risk sectors. So as I mentioned to you, as compared to deviation from typical financial risk managers, which the energy risks managers need to deal with, is there's a huge amount of operational risks involved, which typically needs to be managed. And as you can see in the major global kind of disasters which you have seen in the past, like the, say, Fukushima crisis or the British Petroleum's Gulf of Mexico crisis, or even the the Katrina crisis, you have seen that there's major disruptions in the supply chain of the energy products, which essentially has a lot of effects. And essentially, it's not only the monetary losses, but it's actually a devastation to the environment. So it's the environmental concerns which are also of major issues, because we have seen that in many cases of various disasters, the whole ecology has actually been damaged. Recently in the Indian Ocean, we have seen the various oil tankers which had actually leaked, and there's a huge amount of oil spill near Maldives as well as Sri Lanka, which is causing a major damage to the entire ecology. So we need to also use various, we cannot cut corners in this case. So we have to essentially use kind of various kind of good vehicles, which will be kind of, we need to ensure that there is not much disruption, that there's not much leakage, so that we cannot essentially deal with that kind of damages which they're going to the society, which some of the damages are kind of irreversible. So that's what is a major concern. So these are some of the techniques which you should be using as far as risk mitigation is concerned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sanjoy. Can I ask, do any of the other panelists, have you got a view on this? Would you like to come in?
Yeah. If you're okay, Alex, can I say a few things? Yeah.
Please do.
Okay. Adding further to what Sanjay said, yes, one is the operational risk. Straight actually in Middle East, I mean to say. So any small amount of geopolitical risk here, poses a big risk to the supply of energy and crude to the entire Asian region. And any kind of turmoil here in this Strait of Hormuz basically can, literally, render the supply to the India, China, this kind of countries. It can practically stop the supplies, and now depending on the amount of inventories which are available, if this kind of, any geopolitical risk or war arises, practically I'm going to say that some of these countries can literally become inoperational in the matter of say few months. So that is something which is to be taken care of. Now, what are the parallel sources available in order to keep the continuity of the business, the enterprise, if such a thing arises? Today, we see around the globe, increasingly, there are many countries which, in Middle East itself, in Europe, which are dependent on gas supply, through pipeline and through dedicated source. If those pipelines are just stopped, basically one day, many companies, many countries, many cities practically will come to stop. So, I mean, this kind of risk which can arise due to geopolitics, due to at times maybe environmental reason, etc., are far greater than probably, I mean to say, they will have the equal kind of impact. What something like a big bankruptcy or big bank failure can have in a financial market. To add example of regulatory risk, in 2019, International Maritime Organization (IMO) changed the regulation related to the amount of permitted sulfur in the bunker fuel, which is used as a fuel for the shipping lines. That had a big, huge impact. Basically, the cost for the shipping line for fueling their tankers, for running the operations, literally went up by around 3 to 4 times. At the start of 2020, it was only because of COVID crisis, and because of which the amount of transportation around the world and the businesses came to halt, that the prices fell, and we were able to manage. Else, just because of the one regulatory change, there was one substantial impact on businesses around the globe. Anyone who was dependent on basically transport of bulk transport, which may be ore, or which may be, say, something like food grains or any other thing. So this kind of things are unique to energy risk management, which are generally not there in the financial risk, etc. So, I mean, when a policy is made at an organizational level, there has to be a coherent enterprise risk management policy where energy risk is made a very critical part of it. One more thing, like typically comes even for, like, say, will be electricity supplies, or the power supplies. If you're too much dependent, running, say, a plant or something in a remote area, we're just dependent on, say, one single source of transmission line or something. And I'm to say, you don't have any potential parallel sources of supply, which so you may get in a city, etc., where you have the ring main units kind of power distribution system where you can be fed by parallel sources. Those kind of things also need to be looked at. A big earthquake, practically, say, can render a plant useless or inoperational for months if your the source of supply is disrupted.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Can I come on to another question? Perhaps I'll invite this one at Michael to start with. How do you assess the various mitigation techniques of energy risk?
Well, first, I think it's very important that you understand what you're trying to accomplish, right? So you need to have start with the end in mind, I guess, for your end goal. For me, we're managing a portfolio in the wholesale market that is energy-only market that can move anywhere from minus $250 to $9,000 on a 5-minute basis. And we're trying to create stability for our customers. We're trying to do that while we are on the leading edge, I believe, of the environmental side of the business. We're looking to be 65% renewable by 2027 and be carbon free from our generation stack by 2035. And so we want to create that stability. And so we need to look at the tools available to us that allow us to create that stability while still maintaining affordability. Within the Urcot market, there are quite a few physical and financial tools available to you. And so we look at not only using physical and financial market-based tools, but also in the way we construct our portfolio. Different generation profiles of different types of renewables, geographic diversification, and then looking at storage techniques and optimization tools as well.
Thanks. And would any of the other panelists, would you like to come in with a comment on that or any thoughts?
I'll comment on something that was said previously. I mean, there's a lot of talk about scenario analysis. Basically, you come up with disasters that have occurred, or disasters that will occur, or something like that. There's an assumption in there that all of these disasters have equal probability. I can come up, there's a old expression in risk management, predict disaster and be hailed as a prophet. I could come up with earthquakes, tornadoes, all sorts of stuff. I managed a portfolio once with a nuke in it, and the question was, what's the worst thing that can happen to a nuclear reactor? And the answer usually is like a hurricane penetrates the containment unit. It's not. It's a tornado is present while the hurricane penetrates the containment unit. The question isn't whether these things can happen. The question is, what's the probability of them occurring, and how much does it cost to get rid of this risk? Because eventually you get down to the fact that there are risks inherent in the business, and you can't get rid of them unless you want to just liquidate the portfolio and invest in a bond portfolio or something like that. There are risks, and some of them can't be mitigated because they're just part of the business, and that's what they pay us for. That's what shareholders are buying. So to say that you're gonna, you come up with this long list of KPIs and all this other stuff, what are you gonna do about them exactly is the question. So you're gonna have an earthquake. Are we gonna buy earthquake insurance? No. So there's a practical side of risk management that gets really tossed aside when there's all the enterprise metrics start getting listed. And most of these, quite honestly, and I'll be perfectly frank, are to make the board feel like they've done something about mitigating these risks. When in reality, they haven't done a goddamn thing.
Fair enough. So you feel it's a tick in the box in a way?
Yeah. It's a useless exercise, quite honestly. What they should really be worried about is, do we have on the ground sufficient crisis management? Because that's what happens in energy portfolios. Something happens that you didn't know would happen, like the pandemic. Something comes out of left field. Do we have the staff on the ground that can deal with something like that? Or is it just deer in headlights time? If we have a lot of our counterparties going bankrupt, do we know what kind of collateral they have? And do we know how to draw it down upon it in a quick fashion? I mean, this is managing a real Wall Street-like portfolio where things are happening very rapidly. And that's, where you can go out of business. The stuff that you know or that are going to occur, that you have chances to prepare for, in my mind, are secondary risks because you're preparing for them. You know they're coming, so we're ready for them. It's the stuff that you don't know that just comes out of left field and suddenly that drives prices from $50 to $3,000. Those are the things that are bankruptcy events. And to me, as a risk manager, what I'm trying to do is keep my clients not surprised. It's not to say that you can mitigate every stupid risk in the world, every improbable thing in the world. I mean, I don't go outside and I don't wear a hard hat outside because I'm worried about getting hit by a meteor. Nor do I accept every single thing that people say of what's going to happen in 15 years. Because no one's ever been accurate doing that. ever in the history of the world. So for me to adjust my portfolio and spend billions of dollars basis a probability that I can't assess is a completely different risk management exercise than I'm doing on the market side. So there's my rant as a professional risk manager, not a theoretical risk manager.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Michael and Brett, thank you for that. Should we move on? I've got another question. I'd like actually to put this one to Brett. The effect of and cause of negative oil prices, obviously something we saw earlier this year. Do you think that can happen again? Is it likely to reoccur?
That's a good question. Could it reoccur? In my mind, again, this is the reality of trading versus the theoretics of trading. When it happened, there were a lot of people who said, it was the market, the market worked, supply demand, balanced out. Well, I can tell you as a commodity guy that supply demand imbalances like that have occurred in the past, and we did not get negative prices, nor did we get $50 swings one way or the other in a single day. We never got that. I mean, during 1985, during the Saudi oil price war, we had similar supply demand imbalances. During the Great Depression, we had similar supply demand imbalances. We never had that type of price swing. There's a couple of reasons why it happened. Supply demand's one of them, but there was also a lot of, I think, just mismanagement of the situation by a lot of the FCMs and the CME going into that day, going into the expiration of that contract. So to me, the negative prices were sort of an artificiality, semi-exacerbated by the pandemic. Now, should they have occurred? I don't know. But the CME, one of the functions of the CME is to maintain a fair and orderly market. Should they allow that to have happened? Should they have closed trading for half an hour and let everyone sort of assess what the hell was going on? Probably. They should have. So could it happen again? I mean, I don't think so, but never ever is a long time. It's hard to make that prediction.
No, crystal ball. Yes.
I mean, the people that I speak to, there's options models that handle negative option pricing. I mean, there's huge ramifications for the markets in this negative pricing scheme. Are they switching models to handle the negative prices? Most of them say no, because if we do that, we're going to be overpricing puts and underpricing calls consistently based on a one-time event in the history of crude oil trading, which has been going on since 1865, by the way. So it was a weird event. Again, as I said before, that's an event that came out of nowhere. I mean, people in the know kind of knew what was happening, but it was really a fairly, to the general market, like people who were involved in equity markets and things like that, that came out of completely left field. And it's probably one of the more interesting things that's happened in financial markets in the last 20, 30 years, in my opinion. It's really an interesting, if you're a student of commodity trading, that was really an interesting day.
Thank you. Anybody else got any thoughts on that you'd like to come in?
Perhaps we should have some regulations like equity prices cannot be negative, so maybe commodity prices also should not be negative. We can have some kind of checks and balances in that going further future.
You could make an argument that the exchange, should not allow negative prices. What is the economic good? What is the social good of having negative commodity prices? Was it really clearing the market, or was it somebody manipulating price? Was there all sorts of externalities that produced this? To me, before the exchange allowed that to happen, there should at least, or going forward, there should at least be some discussion as to whether that should take place again amongst market professionals. Is this a rule, or should we just allow this stuff to go nuts every now and then, regardless of the effect?
Yeah, well, on that, I just say we can argue that is one of the most, untraditional events that ever happened. But in reality, if I think about power and gas, especially the spot market, right, so you're almost experiencing negative pricing every day. So it's pretty much like driven by supply and demand, and plus all of these incentive programs put in place. So I think to me it's really hard to put, let's say, or enforce the price being positive, even interest rates, like we're observing all of these negative interest rates around the world. Then yeah, well, I mean, like why? If we want to encourage a free market, there is no reason you want to step in and introduce all of these additional volatilities.
Remember, I've heard that argument a couple of times, especially on the cash side, that I've seen power prices obviously go negative all the time. That's in the cash market, not a futures market. A futures is a federally regulated market, and those exchanges are a business. They're running an exchange. They're not running a theoretical exercise. And people are supposed to be hedging on these markets. If they can't depend upon those prices to being fair and reasonable and not manipulated and not a function of electronic trading or malfeasance, they won't trade.
Well, yes and no, right? So I mean, I agree with your arguments, but if I think about, say, for instance, there is this Waha hub in the U.S., right? So they produce gas, but those gas are mostly associated gas to oil. So if you are able to make a good profit out of your oil production, these gas will always come out. So then from an economic perspective, it's not surprising even the future. If you have a liquid future market, say for next month, the gas price can be negative and people can do it.
We're not going to agree.
I was going to say in the case of Waha, however, that has to do also with the penalties that they may take if they cannot get rid of that gas. So in some cases, it's cheaper for them to pay you to take the gas than to take penalties that they may have with the various facilities out there and pipelines. And then that negative pricing does lead to great pipeline growth. So we've seen quite a few new pipelines come in and come on service and kind of start to fix that problem for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Can I come on to a different, excuse me, a different question now? I'll direct this one initially at Z. How do analytics help to mitigate energy risk?
I'm sorry, would you mind?
Yeah, sure. How do analytics help to mitigate energy risk?
Well, so I tend to say a lot of times, especially if you look at some unmeasurable risks, say for instance like operational risk, in those cases you don't really have a full spectrum of data available, or some of the, let's say, as we just discussed, the disruption risk. So you have to look into the future, and no one would have the crystal ball to handle it. So then, in that case, the evidence and data-driven decisions becomes actually more important. So then, in that case, you would definitely want to leverage the analytics. So, Brad, you just mentioned about some of the scenario analysis. So then, to me, yes, so you can design a scenario analysis, but you really need to back it up by some, let's say, very solid or structured analytics, meaning you cannot just say use some like a very random, even that would represent some stress case, but you don't really have a good understanding of how likely it will happen, how quickly it will hit you, and what's the magnitude. So then analytics can put some boundary around it. So I'll use the example, say, for instance, if we look at these adoptions, there are a lot of, say, bolder statements out there. For instance, for electric vehicle, people can claim, okay, what I'm seeing is the electric vehicle will have nearly 80% of market share in 5 years. So then, as a company, if you want to make decisions on managing these market shift risks, so you have to think about, okay, how likely that will happen, right? So then instead of just surveying all of these different market intelligence, so people can claim one thing or the other, you can probably look at some of the fundamentals. See what's really like the battery supply. What are some of the, say, early adoption patterns that happens in some leading markets? You can develop, let's say, a model. Usually what we did was try to, say, leverage a technique so-called system dynamics. And what it does is to study the interactions between all of these different pieces. So then you also get to put some boundaries around these things. Because at the end of the day, the EV adoption is a conclusion based on a lot of different pieces. So in that regard, you do want to have these structured analysis to back you up. So then you would have some confidence when you make these decisions. So that's for one. And the other thing I'd say is also related to one of the earlier questions that the panel answered. So I think, Michael, you mentioned like diversification. Well, so then how do you measure that, right? So you have like different assets in your portfolio. From time to time, one asset can, like the risk of one asset can offset the risk of other asset types. But at the end of the day, if you can have a sense, okay, my portfolio is pretty balanced, but it's good to put some measure around it. You can define some, say, simple metric to see in reality what is sort of the correlation or interdependencies across these different asset types. Then maybe come up with some analytical measures, so then you can actually monitor your portfolio and see if your concentration risk is increasing or decreasing. So that's what definitely help you to make some very risk-informed decisions, especially when energy markets that changes every day and the volatility levels jumps up and down on a regular basis.
Thank you. Just if anybody else got any thoughts on that? Anything to add to what Z said?
I would say, as someone who deals with hedge funds an awful lot as part of my practice, I get a lot of questions about, is the fund diversified? These are big, equity, commodities, fixed income. They have a lot of different asset classes to diversify themselves or possibly diversify themselves. And the question always becomes whether they're diversifying themselves during extreme events. And usually the answer is no, the diversification falls apart during extreme events when you need it the most. So most energy portfolios I've seen, they're partially diversified, but essentially they're fairly concentrated and fairly undiversified small energy hedge funds. If you put it in the most basic parlance, the amount of diversification you can do with just a couple commodities and in the same asset class, is limited. You're just not going to, it's not like you're going to take an equity portfolio and put it in yours to diversify it. You just can't. So again, it's a risk inherent in the business that you don't have the greatest diversification, and it's, you have all your eggs in one basket, and you better watch that basket very carefully.
Thank you. I'll come on to, we've just got a couple more questions to the panel. As you maybe see on Slido, we've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'll ask a couple more questions to the panel, and then we'll take some questions from the floor, from the audience. The next question I had, it's something a little bit different. Perhaps I could put this to Kaushik. How is the GARP ERP program unique? How has the program evolved over the years to remain relevant with the trends in industry?
So I think the program, ERP program from GARP is the most diverse program that we have as of date. It covers all aspects of energy, starting from oil to natural gas, LNG, then renewable electricity markets, renewable energy markets. So in terms of both diversity, in terms of coverage as well as depth, there is hardly any program that can match the ERP program of GARP. If you are a participant, if you are an aspirant of the GARP ERP program, you might not be a participant, you might be heavily focused on some particular area. Maybe you're in the oil and gas business, or you are in the electricity markets. But by choosing this program, you can have an overall view of the entire energy markets, starting from oil and gas to renewables and everything in between them. The second thing is that as a participant, maybe you are working in a specific market. You are from the US market, or you are from the Indian market. So the program, the ERP program, is very global in its nature. Right? It addresses to all the markets. To give an example, talk about the natural gas market. They talk about how the US markets behave, maybe how the European markets behave, and how the Asian markets behave. Those are three quite distinct markets, although Europe is in a state of flux by migrating oil index natural gas market to one which is spot market based. And Asia is primarily still an oil index market, while the US is based pricing. So a participant gets a whole view. He is not just focused on a particular market, but he gets to see how the entire the market specific domain, be oil and gas, be electricity market, or be it the renewables market, how it is happening, how the things are shaping up on a global basis. And thirdly, the curriculum remains very, very, relevant to the times. Of late, the electricity market is predominantly, we see a lot of renewables coming into the market. So the traditional energy market, by the baseload generation of coal-based markets, they are facing a lot of challenge in terms of that they are not able to, finding it challenging to recover the fixed cost. So how the renewables have come in and disrupt the market, that is something that you get to learn from, the current curriculum that includes an important section about the role of renewables energy and how they are disrupting the market. It also talks about how, whether it's really going to be a disruptive market, or it's going to be a sustained market. Are the incumbent players just going to seize the advantage that the distributed power generation is perhaps providing, and it will not see a disruptive market, but it will become a sustainable market? So that's something that we have to see. So if you see recent research papers that have come up in within the research community, it will be there in the curriculum. So I have seen a migration of the modification of the curriculum from while it was heavily loaded in favor of oil markets, now almost evenly distributed between oil and gas, natural gas, oil and natural gas, as well as electricity markets, and renewables coming into play these days. So I will say that if someone is really looking for having a very broad as well as in-depth view of the global energy markets, ERP is the program to go for. Thank you.
Alec, I'd like to add something to it. So essentially, it's not only about the markets which essentially a participant understands and gains knowledge when going through this course. It's also the risk management part, which is very critical. So as a name of the program is the energy risk program, or energy risk management program. So where not only our participant understands that what are the various aspects of risk management, particularly energy risk, which includes risk identification, risk measurement and assessment, risk mitigation, risk reporting and monitoring, as well as risk governance. But also it helps the participants to also understand some of the basic things like basic mathematics which are required to essentially use for various analytical methods, not only like probability or statistics. So these are the various things which are also included in the course. So to get the participants firm understanding about the various tools which they can use it, and how to use those tools essentially. And apart from that, the standard kind of risk management practices like how to manage market risks, how to manage operational risks. So those are typically being included, including the most popular risk measurement and management techniques like, say, value of risk measurements or expected shortfall computations, as well as the good understanding about the entire ERM framework, enterprise risk management framework, and the various latest developments, which are the risk management, energy risk management practices, which are being used by various market participants. So those are also included in this program, which is essentially a very unique program of its own globally. Thanks. You're not audible, Alec.
Sorry, bear with me. I'm muted for a second. Yeah, sorry. So we've got just one more question to the panel, and then we'll open up for Q&A, because I can see a few questions coming in. I'm just conscious of time. The last question I'd like to please direct at Parvez, and that is, how do you manage the commodity metals, for example, Forex and energy price risk of an organization?
Okay. Alex, can you just repeat? Sorry, I was not able to hear you. There's a lot of distortion.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll read it back. How do you manage the commodity, Forex, and energy price risk of the organization?
Yeah, definitely. See, the process basically starts with the identification stage. It is basically having a policy in place, first of all, to identify and capture the exposure of the organization. Like on commodities, okay, what are these? Metals. Do you have exposure to energy? Maybe oil, maybe gas. I mean, if you have some generators running, or your power supply basically is based on gas supply, etc. At the same time, okay, what is the source of energy for the company? The source of so this will be on the side of metals as well as energy. On Forex, which is the country you're located in, which is a functional currency or reporting currency, and then you look at the both sides of the contracts, the imports as well as exports. On the exports, when you are doing sales, what is the currency? Is it the same as your reporting your accounting currency or different? Same applies on your imports, basically, when you are purchasing your goods or supplies from your suppliers. What is the currency? Does it match your accounting currency or reporting currency? So basically, that is the identification stage. When you capture the exposure, that is the, I mean, actually, the most critical part, because often organizations failure. They don't have good systems in place to be able to capture this exposure. Of course, it also applies similar to interest rate risk. When you need to say basically that, okay, do you have loans which are, or borrowings linked to variable risk like LIBOR, etc. At the same time, are you investing any product in the market? No, from the excess cash, which is linked to any variable interest rate like LIBOR. At times, even if you're investing in a fixed interest rate, that can be also poses a risk, basically. I mean, and if you're borrowing at a variable rate, investing in a fixed rate, so all this kind of risk you need to first capture. Once you capture the risk, you need to see, I'm just saying, need to have a appropriate board-approved policy in place. What is the risk appetite, basically, how much you can manage and how much is the risk probably you can withstand and you want to play around with. Depends on organization for policy. Invariably, most of the organizations, I'm to say, multinationals will have a very clear risk management policy where you need to totally hedge or cover your exposure. So in that case, then you look at the appropriate derivative instruments to hedge the risk accordingly. Most important part here is that when you are hedging the risk, it has to be in line with how your physical business is functioning. You should be matching with the physical business, your risk appetite, your policies, and then based on that, you take appropriate actions in the market. by entering into appropriate kind of, generally it will be a derivative contracts basically that will be entering into. Typically, like, okay, like example, energy. If I am basically, someone who is dependent on, say, gas supply, or basic, I mean to say, okay, if I'm consuming gas for my power plant, then can I hedge it directly? Or at times I will do proxy hedging. Say if there is a very good correlation with Brent or WTI, I may do a proxy hedging using those contracts. Maybe, I mean, if I'm importing a lot of, say, ore or etc., I may be doing a bunker fuel contracts with. Similarly on Forex, I may do forward or I may do option. Depends. Like example, I mean, in certain cases, I mean, it's like, okay, when you sell to European market, I mean, invariably what happens, euro currency, because negative rates trades at a very good premium compared to other currency. So are you already passing the forward premium when you're quoting to a euro customer? If yes, you may do a simple forward contract to earn that premium back from the market. So basically, this is generally how we manage the risk, based on policies which are in place, based on my risk appetite, and of course available options, I mean the instruments in the market.
Thank you. So just quickly, do any of the other panelists, would you like to come in on that point, or we can move to questions? Well, thank you, Parvis. Thank you to all our panelists. I'm conscious of the time. We're slightly over time, so we'll just take as many questions as we can, perhaps in the next few minutes. I'll read the questions coming in from Slido. The first question that's been upvoted is climate risk real? What are the threats and how to overcome them?
They're very real, I would say. Nowadays, where something is called ESG, Environmental Social Governance Parameter for Organization. So basically, sooner or later, I mean to say, the regulations themselves are getting tightened up around the world. At the same time, I'm to say, we see things like green source of financing, green bonds, etc. So these things are definitely going to give a considerable edge to organizations who are far more, sensitive to climate risk and basically, supportive on this on environmental and climate front.
Thank you. Anybody else got any thoughts on that?
So the first part is climate risk real? So obviously it is real. So because if we have seen that the various kinds of different changes are happening in the world, we have seen the vast amount of fires which are there in the California and Brazil, in Argentina. Glaciers are melting. The most kind of frightening thing is increase in the sea level. And if the increase in the sea level is actually in such a manner, then in a few years' time, some of the major cities of the world will be underwater. And not only that, as actually, even if the temperature increases by a couple of degrees, and that's what is happening over the period of time, there will be kind of devastating effects. So you require more energy, it's like electricity demand for cooling, and as well as in the summers, and essentially the decreasing of the electricity or natural gas, heating oil during the various kinds of heating in the winter, because winters are going to be very cold, summers are going to be very warm. In fact, monsoons where essentially are going to be severe. We have seen a lot of places in this world we are having a kind of extreme kind of rainfalls, which is essentially quite kind of leading to a lot of damages. So climate change could affect the amount of water available to produce electricity or to extract the fuel, and it's promoting various public transport and sustainable mobility by increasing the number of journeys in towns, by say bicycle, reducing the number of flights, taking more trains, by shared vehicles. So these are various things where we can essentially mitigate some of the risks of the climate change.
Thank you. So I have another question from the audience. What's the impact of COVID-19 on the renewable energy markets?
I can talk a little bit about what we saw in Urcot with renewable energy and COVID-19. So Austin Energy does have a fairly robust renewable portfolio. We do a lot of it through purchase power agreements, and we have five assets under development right now, coming on between the end of this year and the end of 2023. And I think what we saw mainly was that you had a couple, kind of early on, there was a little bit of a supply disruption potentially. So depending on how far along a project was going to depend on if there was going to be a delay there or not. More on the wind side, I believe. There was a short-term kind of supply disruption on solar modules here. But the other big impact, I believe, is in the tax equity market. We saw the tax equity market become a little less liquid and not quite as robust. And so that made financing a little more challenging for some projects. But for the most part, I believe most of that has worked its way through, and projects are still moving forward. They're just moving forward maybe a couple months later than they originally thought they were going to come online.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To add to what Michael is saying is that it's not only the supply side, but we have seen that the demand side disruptions also quite here, because we have seen lockdowns in many countries, and which essentially reduces the demand. So until unless the demand picks up considerably, we can see that the energy prices of most energy products will be at a reasonably low level. We have seen that the crude oil, say Brent, is going around $40 per barrel, which essentially even a year ago it was hovering nearly $100. So that essentially because of the kind of demands which are not there as of now. Obviously, things might improve if there is a lot of spent-up demand going forward, and which might essentially improve the prices or make the prices slightly higher. So it's not only the supply side constraints, but also demands which are essentially driving the markets.
Yeah, so at the same time, adding to that, apparently there would be short-term impacts, and you also get to look at what's the long-term implication. I'd say in short term, there is definitely sort of a slow down in terms of renewable energy. In terms of like a renewable either construction or expanding due to a number of reasons. So Michael and Sandra, you mentioned the supply side of things, but then also there are financing risks. Then there are also some consolidations taking place across the sector. But I guess in longer term, there are a few things I can see only confirm these renewable trends will continue. First of all, these lockdowns and social distancing measures have actually triggered some historical decline in emission. So then there are definitely some increased public appreciation for this. So then, that all definitely leads to, I would say, easier passage of renewable bills in the future. Then there is also a number of countries that they confirmed that they will have the continued commitment to long-term clean energy policies. So, in that regard, I would say yes. So the COVID-19 has some short-term impact that delays or cancels some of the ongoing projects, but in the long run, I only see the renewables can be still very bullish.
Thank you. I've got another question to ask the panel. What's the impact of energy service companies in the energy sector and changing regulatory framework to encourage ESCOs in private sector? Would you like me to repeat the question? It's quite a long one. So the question was, what's the impact of energy service companies on the energy sector or in the energy sector, and change in regulatory framework to encourage ESCOs in private sector? Then the panel has a view on that, or
No opinion.
no? Oh.
I think what I can say would be basically, as I highlighted earlier, things like green bonds, etc., those kind of things are now coming online. So basically, the importance of green things like being environmental friendly, green financing is increasing. So in general, companies will be far more now dependent on making themselves more energy efficient in order to ensure not only at times it may be a matter of continuing their business in regulatory perspective, but also ensuring that basically they're competitive enough to stay in the business, that they have the enough amount of efficiency so that they are not penalized, or basically they don't lose any kind of benefit that they're getting from the government. So increasingly, we should be seeing much bigger role for the energy services company in the private sector.
Thank you. I've got another slightly different question coming. This is about certification, I believe. Somebody's asking, FRM, that's Financial Risk Manager, or ERP. They're confused. Which one will offer a better paying job? I don't know. That's one the panel wants to answer.
I say go for the FRM.
Absolutely.
Better yet, get a CFA.
Yeah, well, honestly, both of them are pretty useful certificates, and for FRM, that is mostly for financial sector, and ERP is a more tailored certificate for energy industry, right? So then let's say if you are applying for a job in energy companies, if you are holding FRM or ERP, I would say ERP will probably prepare you better for that type of roles in energy company for sure. But it's really hard to select which one would be paying better. I don't know that's I don't know how to answer that question. But again, if you have a strong willingness to, let's say, work in the energy industry, yes, I would say this ERP can provide you a lot of basics of the industry. It also covers a lot of these ongoing issues, the new development, etc., etc. So again, both are good certificates. It's just depending on what kind of knowledge you want to pick up.
Okay, thank you. And just a very quick question.
Add to what G is saying, that essentially both are certificates for risk management, but they are slightly different. One, the FRM is purely for financial risk management when you are focusing much on the financial sectors. But ERP, as G mentioned, that is focused on the energy sector. So essentially, not only kind of develops you for the risk management part, but also gives you a fair amount of understanding about the energy markets itself. Because unless you understand the energy markets, you'll not be able to understand how to manage the risks of the market. For that, you need to understand the market. So those are essentially the differences with ERP and FRM. Both are highly paying jobs, but obviously one is much more broad-based and ERP is much more kind of focused on the energy markets. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. We've got two questions about the certification again. So maybe what I'll do, because I'm very conscious of time, is perhaps roll the two together. The first part is GARP does GARP have a definitive passing percentage criteria? Basically, how many questions do you need to answer to pass the exam? And the second question is non-risk management professionals. Can they become ERP professionals by pursuing the ERP program? So the first part is what's the percentage needed, what's the pass rate for the exam, and the second part is, can a non-risk management professional become an ERP professional by taking the GARP ERP program and certification?
The answer to second would be definitely yes. They just don't evaluate the risk management experience, but various kind of experience actually qualifies for becoming an ERP, which can include experience anywhere related to finance or even energy market. If somewhere or other you can connect to it, you qualify to become an ERP, subject to, of course, clearing the 2 levels of exam.
Thank you.
I mean, like for the first one, my understanding is for all of these certificates, including FOM, URP, and SCR, those tests are based on these like a standard scoring mechanism, right? So, because as you can imagine, when you have these exams from one to another, level of difficultiness can be different. So then, you don't really want to have a criteria based on just how many questions you are able to answer, because that would be unfair to people who takes their exams. So then, it is really based on percentage. I think that's probably the pretty good criteria at this moment.
Thank you. What we do, I realise we're slightly over time, so I don't know if panelists, if you're okay to maybe take just 2 more questions before we wrap things up. So I'm very conscious of time. If that's okay with you guys. One question we had is the penultimate question: any energy commodity hedging tips?
Don't get caught short volatility. Don't assume that liquidity is endless.
Okay.
Markets very strangely under high volatility conditions, and liquidity not like that. You can gain. Know what you're doing. Not for amateurs.
Fair enough.
The volatility of the energy markets are quite high. As you can see in the last 1 year, the annual standard deviation on the typical Brent market itself, as compared to say a Dow Jones volatility during the similar kind of period, is half of that. So those kind of fluctuations are quite there in the energy markets. Many times it's higher than the equity markets also. And that's where you need to kind of understand that if you are able to play with the volatility, if you can trade on the volatility, you have that appetite. First of all, you need to have the appetite to do that. You would be able to do quite a justice to your trading activities and make some decent amounts of money.
I would just like to add that do thorough analysis. Sorry. Oh. Go ahead, Brett.
I said, or you will lose a lot of money and probably face divorce from your wife.
Yeah. Just to add, do thorough analysis, ensure that your exposure and your the hedging contracts you take have a good amount of correlation. The hedging contracts that you choose is liquid enough, basically, and there is no basis risk. Basically, you should be hedging the same. The exposure and the hedging instrument used by you should be, settled in a similar way. One should not be settled based on average of the month. The other should not be spot of single day spot rate in the market.
Thank you. We've got one last question. We'll take this as the last question before we end things. How does the Urcot market work?
I'll go ahead and take that one since I focus primarily on Urcot. So Urcot is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's an ISO, but it's a little bit different than the rest of North America because it's not really interconnected with the rest of the grid. There's a couple very small DC ties, a very, very insignificant amount of local supply. It's an energy-only locational marginal price market with nodes. So there are multiple pricing locations throughout the state. I think there's close to maybe 8,000 different nodes that create a price. And it dispatches every 5 minutes on a security-constrained economic dispatch model, which looks at the contingencies with transmission as well to see if a transmission line went out, would a particular element get overloaded, and if so, we'll adjust with prices there as well. It goes anywhere from minus $250 to up to $9,000, so it can be very volatile. And Urcot actually has a great amount of penetration of renewable energy. There's almost 30,000 megawatts of wind capacity in Urcot, almost 4,000 megawatts of solar. And it's a market that peaks in the summer at about 76,000 megawatts, maybe not even that high in certain summers. And typically you can have loads down in the 40,000 megawatt range. So it's becoming very, very highly dependent on weather to determine what supply is available there. And because of that, we do see a lot of potential areas in the state that become unstable. So we have a lot of generic transmission constraints as well. As mentioned earlier, we do see a lot of negative pricing from time to time when we have a lot of wind on the system. And so it's a market that also has a scarcity price as well. So even when LMPs can be low to meet the system demand, if the reserves are tight, you can still get prices to go fairly high. So that's what we saw kind of this summer. We saw a market where LMPs could be done in the $50 or $60 range, but that a scarcity adder was maybe adding another $800 per megawatt hour over some tight period, creating some higher prices.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody. It's been a great session. I think we've gone slightly over time, so I apologise if everybody was on a tight time scale. Again, thank you to the panel. It's been a fantastic session. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your knowledge and experience. And thank you to the audience for some great questions there. It's been a really good session. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a fantastic weekend. Bye.
Thank you.